Nothing compares to the memories of my life living in the rural United States. This was the life my father had always dreamed of. We lived on a farm in Roosevelt, Utah in its golden age. Our property was lush with acres upon acres of farmland, along with several types of animals, including cows, chickens, pigs, and horses. The scent of the countryside greeted us each morning, along with the crowing of the rooster. We witnessed the most beautiful sunsets and undoubtedly the most stunning starry nights. It was perfect, or at least it seemed so, until that night in 1991. We were what you'd call the perfect nuclear family. My mother, father, and younger brother, Georgie. Leaving the city and his law enforcement career behind, my father truly felt as though he had accomplished his version of the true American dream, owning a farm far from the city's chaos, surrounded by his loved ones. My mother, a retired school teacher, shared this dream with him, which made the transition much smoother. The day-to-day life was truly enjoyable. My mother decided that Georgie and I should be homeschooled, feeling that she could provide a better education than the local schoolhouse. Our mornings were filled with studying while my father tended to the farm from sunup, but we would eagerly try to finish our schoolwork to help our father with chores around the farm. Lois, our mother, wasn't just our teacher. She also tended to the home and provided nutritious meals every day. Life on the ranch always brought something to tend to or resolve, marked by times of prosperity, but also hardship. For instance, in 1988, we faced a severe drought, with months passing without a single drop of rain. This significantly impacted our entire farm's production process. Those were challenging times, as the farm was our family's livelihood. Such events would sometimes bring out a darker side to my father. It wasn't frequent, but when frustrated, he tended to drink, often to the point of unconsciousness. I vividly recall an incident where, in a drunken haze and under the grip of frustration, he mistook a cow for an intruder on the farm. Through the kitchen window, he saw shadows, reacted impulsively, and fired his rifle, shattering the glass. Tragically, the intruder was one of our own cows, which we then had to sacrifice. Thankfully, these incidents were rare, and it was uncommon to witness my father lose control. Stories and legends have always lingered in our area. Many are spun by locals, while others are passed down from generation to generation. These tales and rumors, which are often laced with malice, envy, and rivalry, weren't uncommon amongst the ranchers and farmers in our area. My father even started suspecting Mr. Bennett, our neighbor, whose ranch lay a few miles from ours, of misdeeds. During a particularly rough year on our farm, some of our horses fell ill and even were found dead after some time. But one day, Father left the house at 6 a.m. to feed our strongest of horses, the ones that remained. Dressed like a true farmer in boots, denim overalls, a shirt, and his customary hat, he headed to the stable located close to our house. However, that morning, as he opened the stable door, he was assaulted by a stench so overpowering it almost made him vomit. Following traces of blood on the ground with his eyes, Father discovered 3 headless horses in the stable, eerily arranged in a triangle. Overwhelmed by the sight, as those horses were worth a fortune, he rushed back to the house. He burst through the door, shouting,
"Lewis, I'm gonna kill that son of a bitch Bennett. He kill our horses."
We were asleep, but woke up to his screams. Hastily, we gathered at the stairs just in time to see my father at the door with his rifle. My mother ran towards him, pleading,
"What are you talking about? Stop this. What's wrong with you?"
But my father was beyond reason. He stormed out, got into his truck, and was gone for over an hour. When he returned, he joined us in the kitchen, calmer now, and declared, "That bastard wasn't at his ranch, but he'll pay for this." The truth was, there was no revenge. The situation didn't escalate except for the numerous rumors that sparked around town after the incident. People whispered that Mr. Bennett had orchestrated the killing of our horses, presumably because of their bloodline and status in the circuit. There were wild accusations that he had even stolen the blood from them to enhance his own herd of horses. To many outside of the community, this would sound absurd, but in the countryside, where our livestock is your livelihood, this kind of madness is often spoken of. Many times, after such bizarre incidents like ours would occur without explanation, local gossip was always accompanied shortly after. The farmers, public colleagues, often harbored hidden animosities. And though there was no revenge that day, other times, things did happen. On one occasion, my father resorted to killing 2 of Mr. Bennett's goats. In the farming world, harming another's animals is perhaps the lowest blow one can strike, as countryside livelihoods depend heavily on these creatures. But this seemed the only way to settle their ongoing feud. Such acts had to be carried out with precision. Being discovered could lead to ostracization from the community. However, my father's previous profession held him in high status in the area. With him, actions were executed meticulously or not at all. That night, he stealthily infiltrated the most secluded part of Bennett's ranch. In the goat stable, he quietly snapped their necks and made a couple of incisions in the neck to bleed them, staging the scene to suggest the attack of a wild, aggressive animal. This ruse sparked a wave of panic in the community, with rumors spreading rapidly among the locals. Interestingly, around the same time, goats at other ranches met similar fates. These occurrences sparked score-settling rumors amongst colleagues. When such incidents became frequent, it was necessary to keep watch at night in the areas where our animals were kept. My father often stood guard, accompanied by his workers. Sometimes shots were fired into the air without warning, a signal to anyone nearby that there would be no leniency. During one of these night watches with my dad, we heard the sound of movement through the cornfields. Briefly, we saw a shadowy figure moving amongst the large stalks, but could never get a good glimpse of what had been making such noise. That night did leave an imprint on my memory, but nothing can compare to that one night in December 1991. A night that would change all our lives forever. Despite growing up secluded from the rest of the world, our family maintained our traditions. We celebrated the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, and especially Christmas. It was a time when preparing a big, unique breakfast was our tradition. To make this happen, our parents would travel to town to buy various foods that we couldn't produce on our farm. On December 24th, around 3 in the afternoon, my parents decided to make the trip to town for the essentials needed for our Christmas Day breakfast. To avoid the hassle of taking us along, they opted to leave me in charge of my brother. At that time, Georgie was 7 years old, and I was 14. My father said to me,
"Jack, please take care of Georgie. We will be back in a couple hours, maybe 3. Remember, you are already a responsible young man."
My father addressed me, a 14-year-old boy, but life in the countryside had indeed hastened my maturity. Then, with a caring gesture, my mom gave us both a kiss and cautioned,
"It looks like a storm is brewing, so just watch TV, and when you're ready, dinner's in the microwave. But please, don't leave the house until we get back."
As I watched them leave through the front door, I remembered it wasn't the first time I was left in charge of little Georgie. We settled in to watch TV, hoping to pass the time quickly. However, just half an hour later, we grew tired of the television. True to my mother's prediction, a fierce storm had set in. Inside, we started running around like wild, not needing a yard to expend our energy. Eventually, though, the indoors felt confining. One of our greatest temptations was the attic, a forbidden zone where my father kept his most prized possessions, including his cherished guns. I had never handled a weapon myself, but having seen my father use them so often, I felt almost instinctively familiar with them. Climbing to the second floor, we faced the attic door. Pulling the cord, we watched as the stairs unfolded, leading us to this off-limits realm. There, the rifles lay in pristine condition, each polished and lined up neatly. Some were gifts from my father's time as a sheriff, even engraved with his name. They were, without a doubt, the crown jewels of our family. Of course, I was cautious enough not to let Georgie handle any of the weapons. He merely observed as I held them. As we admired the guns, a loud thud suddenly resonated from the roof, sounding like something had fallen with great force. We both stood frozen, exchanging anxious glances, silently waiting to see if the noise would happen again. It didn't. I was torn between taking a rifle for protection or leaving it behind. After all, getting caught by my father with one of his guns might have led to dire consequences. Yet, at that moment, I wasn't sure if we might need it for self-defense. I only remember that we were both terrified. Quickly, we descended the attic stairs. As we reached the second-floor hallway, the bedroom doors began shaking violently, as if someone or something on the other side tried to break through, yet they remained shut. Our panic surged. Overwhelmed, I couldn't help but shout out loud, "Help! Help!" My legs trembled uncontrollably, and little Georgie was beside me in tears. We were unmistakably amid a crisis. Then, abruptly, the house fell into an eerie silence. The front door started making noises. It was unclear whether it was someone knocking or trying to force their way in. In a panic, I darted to the pantry under the main staircase on the first floor and locked myself in. But as the door clicked shut, I realized with horror that I had left Georgie behind on the stairs. Being smaller and less agile than myself, he hadn't been able to keep up with my frantic pace. In that moment of fear, my only thought had been to hide from the unknown threat outside. Realizing my mistake, I decided to go back for him. Just as I was about to step out of the pantry, the sound of shattering glass stopped me in my tracks. It was like a bomb had gone off, shattering the glass in the house. Instinctively, I closed my eyes and covered my ears with my hands, waiting for the chaos to subside. Time seemed to stand still as I huddled there. All I could do was hope and pray that Georgie had managed to run to the second floor, or that he had found a place to hide. As soon as the crashing noise ceased, I mustered the courage to leave the pantry. My voice, fueled by fear and concern, echoed loudly through the house. "Georgie, where are you? Georgie!" As I approached the stairs, I was confronted with a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Lying there on the steps was Georgie, his body in an unthinkable state, his chest gruesomely ripped open as though by a savage animal. But the most horrifying detail was that Georgie's head was missing, brutally torn from his body. The walls were splattered with blood, painting a nightmarish scene. From that point on, my memories are fragmented. A severe headache engulfed me, and then, almost as if in response to the horror, our parents arrived. It could have been half an hour or merely 10 minutes later. Time seemed irrelevant. What remains indelibly etched in my mind is the sheer heartbreak of their discovery. My father, in a state of shock and desperation, repeatedly demanded of me,
"What did you do? What happened? Who did this?"
I was utterly speechless, paralyzed by shock. Beside me, my mother wept inconsolably. My father, driven by a fierce need for answers, had no intention of lingering to mourn or even to call the police. He was determined to find the perpetrator immediately, and for some reason, he suspected Mr. Bennett. Yet this was beyond any typical feud or conflict. It was an act of brutal and merciless violence. At that moment, considerations of consequences didn't matter to him. He was completely overcome with emotion. With a mix of anger and purpose, he stormed up to the attic, seized one of his rifles, and returned, weapon in hand. Standing before us, his resolve was clear as he declared,
"We need to find who's responsible for this."
He insisted that we accompany him, unwilling to risk further tragedy in his absence. My mother, however, was in a state of shock and unresponsive, so it was I who followed my father. Along the way, we encountered blood trails accompanied by what appeared to be adult-sized boot prints. To my father, this was undeniable evidence supporting his suspicions. We soon arrived at Mr. Bennett's ranch. It looked abandoned, as it often did, but my father was convinced that Mr. Bennett was hiding inside. Intriguingly, at the entrance, we discovered more bloodstains. These, however, differed from the earlier ones. They didn't resemble human footprints, but rather those of a large animal, possibly a bear. Approaching the door, my father knocked forcefully.
Bennett, you son of a bitch, come out and face me.
Without waiting for a response, he knocked again.
Damn you.
The force my father used was so great that the door swung open, its frame crooked, a testament to its age. As we stepped inside, a musty smell wafted out, indicative of long abandonment and dampness. The house was enveloped in dust, making it hard to imagine how anyone could live in such conditions. Without hesitation, my father searched the ground for any signs of recent activity. We moved through the living room, and there, on a dividing wall, we found a door that appeared to lead to the basement. Notably, there were bloodstains on the doorknob. The eerie silence within the house was striking. Whatever had been there had moved with stealth, yet had committed a crime of shocking brutality. At that moment, my father ceased to be the sheriff I knew. He transformed into a vigilante driven by a singular purpose. Pausing before opening the basement door, he turned to me with a resolute expression and declared,
We must do justice for Georgie, even if it costs us our lives.
I didn't have a chance to respond. My heart pounded with fear, unsure of what lay ahead. But my father, with determination, pushed open the basement door. We descended the stairs slowly, my father leading the way with his rifle poised, ready to shoot at a moment's notice. As we went deeper, the light diminished, plunging us into near darkness. Yet, within that gloom, a flickering flame caught our attention. It emanated from deeper within the basement, casting a weak, uncertain light that did little to dispel the shadows. As we entered the basement, we were greeted by a grim sight. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding jars. My father walked over to the nearest shelf and gasped in horror.
What in God's name is this?
What he saw left him in shock. Inside the jar was a human head, unmistakably that of a child. Next to it was another jar, and each subsequent one contained the severed head of a different individual. Shelf after shelf was lined with these gruesome trophies. The sight was so overwhelming that I felt faint and had to steady myself against the wall. Meanwhile, my father, though shaken, began to examine the jars, trying to identify the victims. Suddenly, from the darkest corner of the basement, a jar tumbled and shattered on the ground. We instinctively turned towards the sound, and from the shadows emerged Mr. Bennett, or rather, something monstrous that resembled him. In his grasp was the bloodied head of Georgie, and his hands were not human. They were claws. The sight was so horrifying that my father, normally decisive and quick to act, was rendered motionless. In any other circumstance, he would have ended the threat with a precise shot, but the shock of what stood before us was too great, leaving him questioning the reality of the scene. As we watched, frozen in disbelief, the creature began to transform. It grew in stature, towering over 6 feet tall. What we saw was a wolf-like beast standing upright, a werewolf with an imposing frame. His chest was a grotesque display of skinless bones, with organs visibly pulsating beneath. We stood there, utterly shocked at the sight before us. Then a loud noise filled my ears, sounding like a multitude of people talking and whispering all at once. The noise grew louder and more overwhelming by the second. Desperately, I covered my ears, trying to block out the unbearable sound. I glanced at my father and saw that he too was in agony, contorted in pain. Both of us fell to our knees, screaming. The pain so intense it felt like I might lose consciousness. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the voices began to fade. When I finally lifted my head, the scene had changed dramatically. We were no longer in the basement. Instead, we found ourselves outside, in front of Mr. Bennett's house, engulfed in flames. I looked around, disoriented, until my eyes met my father's.
Son, are you all right?
I acknowledged the situation with a nod. We had come seeking answers, but instead we were left with even more questions. As the house continued to burn, a shadow in the distance moving among the bushes caught my attention. My father noticed it as well. We found ourselves locking eyes with a large black wolf. I stood frozen as the creature stared back at us. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the wilderness. The encounter with the beast left an unforgettable mark on me. Its piercing gaze seemed to steal a part of my soul, a memory vividly etched in my mind.